It gives an overview of different ways area matters in linguistic classification and typology. We will start off with this premise that linguistic diversity can be assessed along different dimensions. So what do we mean by that? We mean that we can classify them in different ways. So the first type of classification that we can carry out is we can look at the language family that a language belongs to. So every language around the world either belongs to a family or we don't know where it belongs and then it's an isolate. And the classification of languages according to their language family affiliation is the genealogical level of classification. Then we may also describe languages in terms of the demographic characteristics of their speakers. So this is the demographic level. We ask here questions that are very close to social linguistics. How many speakers does the language have? Is the language alive and kicking? Is it endangered or even dying? Is the community isolated or well connected to other speaker communities? And questions like that. That's all to do with demographics. Then we have the description of languages in terms of their grammatical structures. This we call the structural level, and this is the domain of linguistic typology, which deals with the study and comparison of language structures all the way from phonology to pragmatics. And then we have the so-called areal level, and that's the focus of this video. There are 3 dimensions, or possibly more, but at least 3, in which area matters when it comes to the study of languages. First up, linguistic areas, or Sprachbunde. Then we have geography at large, or at least the consideration of where a language is spoken as an explanation for linguistic diversity. Linguistic diversity meaning how many languages are spoken in a certain area here, very specifically, or geography and area as some kind of clue towards, or an explanation towards the presence or absence of certain features of languages. And then the third point here that kind of goes beyond point number 1 here is correcting for potential contact when we do linguistic typology, looking at what we might call sometimes macro areas. And that's the focus of this video. We're going to start by looking quickly at point number 1 and 2, and then we're going to go into point number 3 here. So first up, linguistic areas. Here we have a short definition of what that is. So what a linguistic area or Sprachbund is. These are groups of languages that share no systematic sound correspondences. So the languages that are included in a linguistic area do not share a family, or they're not genealogically related, or only remotely. But they do have a significant amount of shared features in grammatical structure and word formation that we can't find an explanation for. And the idea, of course, is that the explanation is rooted in language contact. So this is when lexicon, grammatical characteristics, other linguistic features spread between languages when speakers of these different languages are in contact for longer periods, right? So basically what happens is that we have geographically close languages, and the speakers of those languages tend to be multilingual in several of those, and therefore certain features are borrowed across language borders, and in a way these languages converge towards having specific characteristics. And the textbook example of a Sprachbund is the Balkan Sprachbund. On the left you have a map where you can see that the languages involved are Albanian, Macedonian, Greek, the Tauriac variety of Serbian, Bulgarian, Romanian. And in the table on the right you can see the features that are shared between them. And these deal with articles and case, the behavioral pronominal clitics, the characteristics of subjunctive constructions, and also the presence of evidentials. And you don't have to really understand the details to see that what becomes quite clear from the table is that the relevant features are not shared by all languages. Rather, we have a kind of patchwork of overlaps. So if you look closely at the table, you see that clitic doubling, which is right about in the middle over here, is shared by all languages, but for some other features here, for example, having a merger between the dative and accusative, we have that in Greek, and we have it in over here, but we don't have it, for example, in Albanian and Aromanian. So this illustrates the point that clear-cut boundaries of areas are difficult to draw, and we're going to come back to this later. And of course, I mean, knowing that this is the textbook example of a Sprachbund, you know, what could it be like for other Sprachbunds? Yeah, it's not easy. So there is quite a lot written on the topic of the linguistic area or the Sprachbund. I have here a YouTube talk by Hunter Lookwood on the Pacific Northwest linguistic area, which is really interesting. And of course, if you want to read stuff, there's a book called From Linguistic Areas to Areal Linguistics, edited by Pieter Muysken, which has several chapters in it on specific areas and also general considerations. And then at the bottom you have there a paper by Sarah Thomason on how we can interpret linguistic areas from a historical perspective. So this is all interesting stuff to learn more. We are going to move to the second type, the second way area matters when we are classifying languages and when we're doing typology. And I said that this was to do with geography at large as an explanation for linguistic diversity and presence or absence of certain features, which is a very long topic, but we want to split it up into two parts. So the first two papers on the slide mentioned here have to do with linguistic diversity purely in terms of where the most languages are spoken. And the second two papers on the slide have to do with using geography as an explanation for the presence or absence of certain features. And both of these topics are pretty well researched, and we'll see a little bit more about them, especially the latter one. If you want to stick with YouTube, you can watch a talk by Caleb Everett, who has pioneered much of these ideas. You can watch that on YouTube and learn about these global phonetic patterns that are rooted somehow in geography and area. So first up, we have Nettle, who has, in a way, started this whole trend, I would say, because we have lots of work on this now, on explaining where language diversity is. So in which places of the world do we find lots of languages, and where do we find few languages? And he looked at that from a country-based perspective. That's why on the map you see different countries, and the darker they are, the more linguistic diversity is attested in those countries. So he observed the following patterns, that there is great linguistic diversity around the equator, especially the tropical rainforests. These have belts that harbor great diversity. There's one belt across Africa, there's one belt kind of in Southeast Asia or southern India leading out into the Eastern Pacific all the way into Papua New Guinea. And what he noted was that these patterns of linguistic diversity, they correspond to species diversity, right? So where we find lots of languages, we also find lots and lots of different species. And ultimately, in this paper, he makes the point that we can explain these global patterns in terms of ecological risk. So what he says is that there is a strong positive relationship between low ecological risk, which basically implies the ability of communities to grow food all year round or to gather food all year round, and the number of languages spoken in a country. So the idea here is that especially the rainforest environment, it harbors many species and many different linguistic communities, because communities can stand on their own 2 feet, right? They don't have to interact with other communities. And this is a great precondition for linguistic diversity. Whereas in other places where, for example, it's pretty cold or it's pretty dry, so you can't grow food all year round, you have to rely on so the community relies on larger areas in general to survive, which may also makes them engage more with other communities that might speak other languages and therefore might also adopt the language of that community. So languages may also spread over greater amounts of space in places where ecological risk is higher, right? Where you cannot stand on your own 2 feet for much time of the year. Like I said, Nettle's work triggered quite a bit of work on that, where, well, trying to explain global language diversity. So people have done that on different terms. So they've looked, for example, at climate most of all. So this relates to Nettle's ecological risk hypothesis. They've also looked at geographical features such as mountains and rivers, and also at biodiversity. And this is a review paper by Hua et al., which is 5 years ago now that they've published that. And they do a very large analysis looking at different perspectives and conclude that climate indeed is the most important factor. So here we have this idea that indeed there is something about climate that interacts with how many languages are spoken in a certain place, and then ultimately that might also interact with what those languages look like from a structural perspective. So the second point here that I wanted to make was relating this idea that geography at large can be an explanation for the presence or absence of certain features. As I said, Caleb Everett has pioneered most of that work looking at specific phonological features. And here is one example of his work on that, where he has a paper called Languages in Drier Climates Use Fewer Vowels. And this is one of the figures from that paper showing that on the x-axis we have mean humidity. So the more humid an environment is where a language is spoken, then the mean vowel index on the y-axis goes up, right? So you have a positive correlation here. And we should note that this figure actually does not give us individual languages, but it gives us the mean value per language family. So also for language families, it's true it demonstrates in this paper that mean humidity has a positive relationship with mean vowel index. There's quite a bit of that also on different aspects of phonology, different aspects of what climate looks like in different areas of the world. And here there's one paper that has critiqued the part of this work. So this is actually a figure plotting the same data as you just saw on the previous slide. It's a study by Hartmann et al. Called Methodological Problems in Quantitative Research on Environmental Effects in Phonology. So the study in this paper tries to demonstrate that there are two reasons why the work on environmental effects on phonological variables is problematic. So the first reason is statistical, because some of that work has not dealt in an appropriate way with how to model variables and modeling techniques that deal with family relatedness and also spatial autocorrelation and nonlinearity. And we're going to come back to what that means in a second. Hartmann's point is that this can yield false positive results. And the second critique that he has is that conceptually the causal relationships between the variables are not well understood, meaning that it's not altogether always clear why a certain phonological characteristics should be found, for example, in a humid place versus a dry place, and other climatic factors are considered here as well. So that concludes a little bit this concludes the idea that geography can be an explanation for the presence or absence of certain features, and we're going to move on to the third type. So I said that areal classification matters for language contact, for Sprachbund and beyond, and that's where we are ending up now in the video. So one thing that we would like to do as linguistic typologists is correcting for, let's call it now, potential contact. And what does that mean? So we have to start from looking at what linguistic typology does first. So as I said in the beginning, linguistic typology is the cross-linguistic study and comparison of language structures, all the way from phonological characteristics to morphology, syntax, semantics, the lexicon, and also pragmatics. But it's also concerned with explaining the patterns that emerge from a comparison. And these patterns have been framed in ideas about what is universal across human languages and what is not universal. So linguistic typology goes hand in hand with the idea that certain aspects are universal and not. And this has started with the pioneering paper of the subfield that we're talking about here, which is the paper by Greenberg on some universals of grammar with particular reference to the order of meaningful elements. And in that paper, Greenberg posited 40 or so universals. So these are claims about what features go with what other features in the world's languages, or also simply, in some cases, they are not correlational, they are simply statements about the most common patterns, right? And what linguistic typologists want to do is test these patterns further, and they also want to be able to explain them. So we're going to take number 2 here and explain a little bit more about that. So now you have on this slide, you have the definition that I just discussed and universal 2, which states in languages with prepositions, the genitive almost always follows the governing noun, while in languages with postpositions, it almost always precedes. And it doesn't really matter if you know what that means or not. The point is that we are dealing here with the correlation between two grammatical features, and we want to know if that's true in the world's languages or not, right? So Greenberg, on the basis of a rather small sample 50 years ago, said this is true. And in modern linguistics, we are concerned with, okay, how do we actually test that hypothesis, right? And here we are dealing with a notion that also came up in Hartman's discussion of the work by Everett, namely autocorrelation. And this is the issue that in some types of data, including linguistic data, data points are not independent from one another. For example, because of shared inheritance, right? Or because of areality. And what does that mean? You can look at the figure on the right and observe, okay, there are two types of languages on this purple plane, right? We have yellow languages and we have green languages. And we want to know something about the distribution of those. But the point is that we have to take into effect that ultimately, if we look at the tree, at this tree that kind of leads towards the languages being on the purple plane, there's only one. So they all started from one descendant, which happened to be yellow. So all of the yellow languages have inherited that feature from their ancestor. Whereas there's only one change towards green, and then 3 out of 4 green languages have inherited that from their ancestor. And then we have one contact event in which a yellow language happened to locate itself, or the speaker community of that yellow language happened to locate themselves close to green languages and has therefore adopted the green, right? And this is the kind of data that we have to make independent inferences on, right? So we want to know something about language. We have to take into account the fact that languages are similar because of shared inheritance and because of what we call here areality, and languages by themselves do not constitute independent data points for doing these types of analyses. So typologists have been aware of that for a long time, of course, and for a long time they've tried to deal with that in terms of sampling, and so they've tried to say, okay, we are going to pick languages from different areas and different families, and then we avoid introducing these biases in our data sets, right? A prime work on that is by Dreyer. So he had a plan for testing universals that was rooted in this idea that there are large linguistic areas that are somehow convergent zones, and these correlate with the continents. So what he did was to have a very large worldwide sample, and in order to deal with the genealogical basis, he said, no, let's not count languages, let's count genera. So these are genealogical units similar to Germanic, which is the ancestor of, for example, Scandinavian languages, German, Dutch, and English, or Romance, which is the branch of Indo-European where French and Italian and Spanish belong. So he's going up in the family in terms of genealogical affiliation. And then he says, okay, we're going to divide these genera. They belong to 5 continental areas: Africa, Eurasia, Australia, New Guinea, North America, and South America. And we determine in how many of the 5 areas the hypothesis that's being tested is true. And if it holds in all 5, then the hypothesis is considered to be confirmed, right? So in this way, we deal with both genealogical and with areal bias in some way, right? And this was a very influential, very influential work. And you can see at the bottom of the slide that indeed there are correlations similar to the one that we just saw for the genitive construction and the adpositional construction in the words languages that are very strongly supported also across areas. The problem with that, though, is that there are areas that go beyond the continents. So this is work done by Bickel and Nichols, who defined the Pacific Rim as a big area. And I couldn't really find a picture, so here I have the Pacific Ring of Fire, which kind of relates to the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Rim area in linguistics, in a sense that, so the Pacific Rim of Fire is this chain of volcanoes, but where these volcanoes are and where, of course, also native languages spoken, and these belong to this Pacific Rim area, which is characterized by having numeral classifiers, having head marking, having personal pronouns that have specific forms with initial and and these have a striking distribution kind of along the coast of the Pacific Rim. So if we want to deal with potential contact, right, which we do, macro areas of the type that Dreyer introduced do not suffice. And then, of course, we also have to consider that it's generally hard to define a linguistic area anyway, right? So here are two citations from a paper by Lyle Campbell, the paper is called "Why is it so hard to define a linguistic area?" And you can read this for yourself on the slides, but it's basically what we understand about linguistic areas is depressingly meager. And Campbell's solution for that would be to understand the changes themselves, in particular in this instance, the changes diffuse across languages, and it's not important nor practical to try to force the various sprawling, overlapping, and intertwining diffuse traits to fit together into coherent geographical spaces. But of course, this is all well and good if you want to study linguistic areas, right? But if you want to do linguistic typology and control for area, right, to make sure that you are not biasing your language sample or accounting for languages being similar because they have been in contact, or they have been potentially in contact, right? You don't know, then not being able to define them exactly, right, does not help us further. So one further aspect of this is maybe we should change macro areas into micro areas, right? So here is a proposal that has been created in the context of Autotype, which is a very big typological project. Very big typological database, who come up with 24 areas around the world that you can see depicted here. But then, of course, if we use these, then we should probably also use macro areas at the same time. And we should also allow for the addition of, super areas, something like the Pacific Rim. And then we are dealing with areas on different levels again, right? Of course, the problem here also being that not all linguists would agree with these micro areas either, right? So that's the general problem that Campbell also points out in the paper, that linguists also disagree about what are relevant areas. One last kind of solution for that, in a way, is inferring zones of likely contact. And this is very recent work that's been ongoing as well, so we might expect updates on this type of work soon. This is a paper by Ranaga et al., Contact Tracing in Cultural Evolution, a Bayesian mixture model to detect geographic areas of language contact. So here we are no longer dealing with just linguistic areas for which we have, at least some understanding of what happened historically, and we have a very strong idea about the features, right, that are deterministic in making up that area. But here we have computational approach to detect where language contact has likely taken place, because similarities between the languages that are attested in those areas, the best explanation for those would be contact, right, as opposed to inheritance or universal preferences. So this S-Bayes algorithm takes into account all three options, right? So similarities can be explained in terms of inheritance, like as we saw before. or universal preference towards that feature arrangement, or maybe it's actually contact, and therefore it tries to extract those features that are best explained through contact areas, and the map shows some of these contact areas in the Balkan. So it actually shows that the Balkan Sprachbund is made up out of three, let's say, sub areas that are then interconnected within the bigger area. So this is ongoing work that could hopefully then give us a set of geographic areas of language contact, right? That could then inform our analysis if we want to control for areality in a typological analysis. But for now, what people are mostly doing is what we might call spatial phylogenetic modeling, where we basically measure the distances between languages, and we account for those in a statistical model where we test, for example, correlations between linguistic features. So an example for that is on this page, on this slide here. This is a paper by Shebakova et al. Societies of strangers do not speak less complex languages. So here we have a paper that deals with the idea that language complexity is modulated by demographic classification, right, as we saw in the beginning. But that doesn't really, so I'm not going to go into the details of the paper. The idea here, so this is a quote directly from the methodology, where they say we adopt spatial phylogenetic modeling that allows us to study the relation between socio-demographic and linguistic factors while taking into account the complex spatial and genealogical relations between languages and societies. So how do they do that, right? They have something that's called a covariance matrix, and you have an example of that on the right, actually a very random example in the way that it's just the distance between cities, US cities, right? So we have Los Angeles, the distance towards Seattle is 5, whatever, I don't know the unit there, and the distance between Los Angeles, between Miami is 11, etc., etc. And these types of matrices are taken into account in this type of analysis that they conducted. So they write, both spatial and genealogical relations are represented as random effects built on the basis of covariance matrices that stand for the relevant historical processes. So this is a kind of ad hoc solution in a way that people are using at the moment because we do not have consensus on where areas are, right? Where geographical areas of potential and real contact are. And we will see more work on this in the future in trying to resolve the question of geographical autocorrelation when we do typology. So the takeaway from the video is that we started out by this idea that languages can be classified along different dimensions, including the genealogical level, the demographic level, the structural level, and that there are 3 ways in which area matters. I quickly discussed the idea of language areas, but there's lots more for you guys to explore by yourselves there. The same for geography at large as an explanation for linguistic diversity and the presence or absence of certain features, most of them phonological. Again, lots of input that you can get there. But this idea of correcting for potential contact, I made the video because there's less on this topic, and therefore I wanted to give this quick overview. And what we can take away on this matter is that dealing with area definitely matters. If we want to do typology, correcting for areality rooted in potential and real contact is essential for making correct inferences, but how to best do that is an open question at the moment. So what we can take away is that language contact may be highly local in some places and widespread in others. So that means that there's no single measure, like in terms of kilometers or anything else. There's no single measure of contact that's rooted somehow in geography. Additionally, linguists do not agree on a set of language areas that's relevant, or even on other zones in which features were shared. But hopefully, there is some ongoing work on how to estimate these computationally, and hopefully we can take away this work and use that. And then more specifically, macro areas of continent size are too coarse, right? They contain multiple Sprachbunde, but they're also too shallow in other respects, thinking about, for example, the Pacific Rim area. Micro areas do not capture larger zones of convergence or diffusion, so if you would want to use them, you would be dealing with several levels, which creates problems actually from a statistical perspective that I haven't discussed here. And then lastly, measuring areality in terms of pure distances might actually be quite uninformative for larger distances. It might have this objective feel to it, but it's probably not very realistic. And we might be best off in a way waiting for better ideas about where we actually have convergence zones and where we clearly don't. That concludes the video for today. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Here come the references, and thanks again for listening.